One hot morning, when Mary was 9 years old, her own servant Zadie didn't come to dress her as usual. Mary had a tantrum, but no one would tell her what was going on. When she was tired of being cross, Mary wandered outside and made a pretend garden by sticking red flowers into the earth. She overheard her mother talking with a young army officer. Her mother was beautiful and wore pretty lace dresses, and Mary loved looking at her. But this morning her mother looked scared. "Is it so very bad?" Mary heard her say to the officer. "Awful," he answered. Mary listened as the officer explained that a disease called cholera had broken out. Just then a terrible wail came from the servants' quarters, and Mary's mother clutched the man's arm. "I'm afraid someone is dead," whispered the officer. Mary soon learned that it was her servant Zadie, who had fallen ill in the night. Awful things happened quickly after that, and more servants died. Mary hid in her nursery all of the next day, but no one came to look for her. It seemed she was entirely forgotten. The house grew quiet, and Mary slept for a long time. When she woke, a man she had never seen before opened the door. He was horrified to see her, but Mary was only cross. "I am Mary Lennox. I fell asleep when everyone had the cholera. Why was I forgotten?" she said, stamping her foot. "Poor little thing," he said. "There's nobody left." And so Mary discovered that both her father and mother had died. Mary didn't know her parents well enough to miss them, and she was far too selfish to be sad about it. Mary lived with a vicar's family until she could be sent back to England. The vicar had 5 children, who argued all the time. Mary didn't like them. On the second day she was making another garden when one of the boys suggested she plant some flowers in amongst the rocks. Mary shouted at him, and he began to tease her. "Mistress Mary, quite contrary! How does your garden grow?" he sang. Soon all the children called her Mistress Mary, and Mary hated it. She was relieved when the news came that she was to move to England and live with her uncle, Mr. Archie Blake Craven, at Miss Belthwaite Manor. Mary travelled by ship to England. It was a too long, difficult journey. The officer's wife, who had been asked to look after Mary on the ship, was glad to hand her over to Mr. Craven's housekeeper in London. Mrs. Medlock, the housekeeper, was plump, with red cheeks and black beady eyes. Mary thought she looked unpleasant. Mrs. Medlock thought Mary looked spoiled. They took a long train journey. Mary sat silently until eventually Mrs. Medlock said, "You're going to a strange place, Les. It's a big, gloomy house that's 600 years old and has nearly 100 rooms. It's right on the edge of the moor. Mr. Craven won't take any notice of you. He sees no one. He has a crooked back, and that set him off on the wrong foot. Until he married he was a bitter, miserable young man. His wife was sweet, pretty young thing, and changed him. But now she's dead. He doesn't care about anybody." Mary was not concerned. She sat crossly whilst the rain poured down in the window panes. She soon fell asleep, and when the train stopped, Mrs. Medlock shook her awake. A carriage took them across the moor to Miss Welthwaite. Mary looked out of the window, curious at last to see where they were going. She felt the long drive would never end. "I don't like this place at all," she grumbled. Finally they stopped in front of a long, low house built round a stone courtyard. Mrs. Medlock led Mary through a maze of staircases and corridors to her room. There was a fire in the grate and a meal on the table. "Well, here you are. This room and the one next door are yours," Mrs. Medlock said. "You are to stay in them. Don't you forget that." In the morning, Mary opened her eyes to see a young housemaid cleaning the fireplace. The housemaid was called Marcia. She saw Mary looking out of the window at the expanse of dull, purplish land that stretched into the distance. "That's the moor," said Marcia. "Do you like it?" "No," said Mary. "I hate it. Who's going to dress me?" "Can't you dress yourself?" Marcia asked. "No," replied Mary. "My servants always dress me." "Well, it's time you learned," said Marcia. But just this time Marcia did help Mary put on the new clothes that Mr. Craven had told Mrs. Medlock to buy. They were much nicer than the clothes she had worn to travel back from India. At first Mary ignored Marcia and she chatted. In India she had grown up in a house where servants were ignored, and she wasn't interested in what a maid said to say. But Mary soon began to listen as Marcia talked about her home, her 11 brothers and sisters, and how they all played on the moor. She especially liked to hear about Dickon, who had a pony of his own that he had found on the moor. But Mary did not admit this. The next day at breakfast, Mary did not feel like eating her porridge. Marcia hated to see food wasted. "My brothers and sisters never had a full stomachs in their lives. They're as hungry as young hogs," she said. "I don't know what it is to be hungry," said Mary. "It would do you good to try it," Marcia said. "Put on your coat and go and play outside." "I don't want to," said Mary. "Go on, now," Martha said. "Our Dickon goes off on the moor by himself for hours." As there was nothing else to do, Mary did go outside after all. Before she went, Martha told her story about a garden that no one had been in for 10 years. Mr. Craven shut it when his wife died. It was her garden. She locked the door and buried the key, Martha said. As Mary walked, she thought about the garden, wondered whether she would be able to find it. She followed paths and walked through the walled gardens until she saw an old man digging. "What's through that door?" Mary asked him. "A kitchen garden," he answered. "There are more beyond this one, and an orchard too." Once in the orchard, Mary could see treetops peeping over a wall, and a bird with a bright red breast perched in one of them. The wall carried on past the orchard, and Mary wondered if it was the wall of the secret garden. Mary thought about the key to the garden. Why had Mr. Craven buried it? If he loved his wife so much, why did he hate her garden? For a long time she looked for a door, but couldn't find one. At last she walked back to the gardener and told him about the pretty bird she'd seen. The man whistled, and the bird landed near his foot. "What kind of a bird is he?" Mary asked. "He's a robin redbreast." "You the lass from India?" "Yes." Mary nodded. "What's your name?" "Ben Weatherstaff," he answered, with a rough chuckle. "And this little bird is the only friend I've got." "I have no friends at all," said Mary. "You're a good bit like me, then," Ben said. "Neither of us is very pretty, and we're both as sour as we look." Suddenly a clear bright sound filled the air. The robin had flown to a tree near Mary and burst into cheerful song. "He wants to be friends with you," Ben said. "Would you be friends with me?" Mary asked the robin. "You sound like Dickon talking to his wild creatures." "I've heard all about Dickon," said Mary. The robin ended his song, gave a little shake of his wings, spread them, and flew away over the wall. "He's flown into the garden with no door!" Mary cried. "He lives there," said Ben, "among the red rose trees." "I should like to see the rose trees," said Mary. "There must be a door somewhere." "Not as anyone can find. Don't poke your nose in where it's not wanted. Now run along." Ben slept. Every day seemed the same to Mary. Each morning she ate a little breakfast, and then realized that if she didn't go out, she'd have to stay in and do nothing. So she went out. Little did she know, this was the best thing she could have done. The fresh air was good for her, and it soon put color in her cheeks, and a sparkle in her eye. After a few days she was hungry enough to eat all of her breakfast, and that pleased Martha. Mary still hoped to find the door to the deserted garden. One day she was looking up at a spray of ivy hanging down from the wall when she saw the robin again. He twittered and hopped along, and Mary ran after him. Poor, thin, plain, Mary actually looked pretty as she played. At last the robin flew to the top of a tree on the other side of the wall. "He lives in the garden without a door," Mary said to herself. "How I wish I could see what it's like." The hidden garden gave her something to think about. At last she felt pleased to have come to Miss Southway. In India she had always been too hot and never cared about anything. Now she stayed outdoors all day, and when she sat down for her supper she felt hungry and well. She was no longer cross when Mother chattered away, and even Quiet liked to hear her talk. One evening Mary asked Martha why Mr. Craven hated the garden. "There was an old tree with a branch like a seed," said Martha. "Mrs. Craven used to sit there, but one day the branch broke and she fell and died. The doctors thought Mr. Craven might go out of his mind." Mary looked into the fire and listened to the wind, but she began to hear something else. "Do you hear anyone crying?" she said to Martha. "No," Martha answered. "It's the wind. Sometimes it sounds as if someone is lost on the moor, wailing." "But listen," said Mary. It sounds like it's coming from the house." "It's the wind," Martha repeated firmly. The next day it poured with rain, and Mary couldn't go out. She wandered around the house, exploring rooms she had never been in. On her way back to her own floor, she heard the crying again. Mary put her hand on the tracery next to her, and to her surprise, a door hidden behind it fell open. Mary peered through the door and saw Mrs. Medlock marching angrily along a corridor towards her. "I heard crying," said Mary. "You did not hear crying," Mrs. Medlock said, and she grabbed Mary and dragged her back to her room. Mary sat on the rock, trembling with rage. There was someone crying, she said to herself. 2 days later, the sky was startling blue and Mary could go outside again. Spring was coming. She looked at the green sparks of crocuses and daffodils coming off through the grass, and then she saw the robin picking in a pile of freshly dug earth. There was something partly buried in the earth that looked like a ring. The robin flew away and Mary stooped to have a look. She brushed away from the soil. It was a large key. "Perhaps it's been buried for 10 years," she whispered. "Perhaps it's the key to the garden." Mary looked at the key for a long time. She was curious and desperately wanted to see what was inside the garden, and what had happened to the old rose trees. She put the key in her pocket, so that if she did ever find the hidden door she would be ready. While Mary was outdoors, Martha went to visit her mother, and she got back. She said she had shared news of Mary with her mother, brothers and sisters. They were all eager to hear more, and Mary promised to tell Martha new stories about India. Martha gave Mary a present from her mother. "What is it?" Mary asked in wonder. "It's a skipping rope," cried Martha. "So you have elephants and tigers and camels in India, but no skipping ropes?" Martha had to show Mary what to do, but she skipped until her cheeks were red. As she skipped in the garden, Mary felt the heavy key in her pocket. When she saw the robin, she said, "Robin, yesterday you showed me the key. Now show me the door." What happened next seemed like magic. No sooner had she finished speaking than a gust of wind blew the hanging ivy aside, and, for just a moment, Mary glimpsed a door-knob. She quickly pushed the ivy away, and there, right in front of her eyes, was the hidden door. She took the key from her pocket and turned it in the lock. The old door cracked as Mary pushed it slowly open, and she took a few cautious steps forward. At last she had found it. At last she was standing inside the secret garden. A thick tangle of climbing roses covered the high walls, but only their leafless stems remained. The roses had grown over the other trees and hung in circles and made bridges between them. Mary wondered if they were dead. She didn't know enough about plants to tell, but the pale green spikes of growing plants pushed through the grass, so Mary knew that the garden was not completely dead. The grass under her feet was so thick that there didn't seem to be room for the shoots to grow. Mary dug away the weeds and grass around the new spikes with a piece of wood. She worked carefully and for a long time, until it was time to go in for lunch. At the main door, Martha served Mary a lunch of meat and rice pudding. which Mary ate hungrily. "I wish I had a little spade," Mary said to Martha after she had eaten. "Then I could dig and make a garden of my own." There was a shop in the village that sold garden sets and seeds. Martha suggested Mary should write to Deacon and ask him to buy them and bring them over. Mary had enough money, as Mr. Craven left some for her each week. She was excited about getting a new spade, but even more excited that she might meet Deacon. The sun shone for a week, and every day Mary went back to work in a secret garden, digging and pulling up weeds with her hands and a piece of wood. Then one day, on her way to the garden, she saw a boy standing under a tree playing a wooden pipe. He was about 12 years old and had a turned-up nose and rosy red cheeks. The girl clung to the trunk of the tree, and two rabbits sat nearby. She knew at once it had to be Deacon. Deacon had brought the tools and some seeds for Mary, and offered to plant them. But when Deacon asked where her garden was, Mary didn't know what to say. "Keep a secret," she said, clutching at his sleeve. "I've stolen a garden. Nobody wants it, or cares for it though, and no one ever goes there." "Where is this garden?" asked Deacon. Mary took him to the door, left the hanging ivy, and led him into the secret garden. For 2 or 3 minutes Deacon just stood and stared. "I never thought I'd see this place," he said at last. "Did you know about it?" asked Mary. Deacon nodded. Mary asked Deacon if he thought the roses were all dead, but he cut a stem open to show her that they were still alive inside. Deacon saw the patches Mary had cleared round the bulbs. "A lot of work to do here," he said. "Will you come again and help me to do it?" asked Mary. "Oh, do come, Deacon." "I'll come every day if you want me to," he answered. They worked happily together until the big clock struck the hour for lunch, and Mary had to go inside. Mary ate lunch quickly, eager to get back to Deacon. But then Martha said Mr. Craven had returned from London and wanted to see her. Mrs. Medlock led her to a room she had never seen before. Mr. Craven was sitting in an armchair by the fire. He had high, cropped shoulders and looked awkwardly at Mary. "Are you well, child? Is there anything you want?" he asked. "Might I have a bit of earth to plant seeds?" "You can have as much earth as you want," he sighed. "Take it and make things grow. Now please go, as I am tired." That night Mary was woken by the wind and rain beating against her window. She lay and listened, and soon realized it wasn't just the wind. She could hear the crying sound again, too. Mary took a candle and padded to the corridor and had found behind the tapestry. The crying led her into a big room where a boy lay sobbing in the bed. Mary crept towards him. "Are you a ghost?" he sniffled when he saw Mary. "No," she answered. "Are you?" "No, I'm Chloe Craven. Who are you?" "I'm Mary Lennox. Mr. Craven is my uncle." "He's my father," said the boy. "Your father!" Mary gasped. "He has a child." Colin explained that he hated to be looked at, and that he was always ill. "If I live, I may grow lumps on my back and be a hunchback, but I shan't live." he said. "My mother died soon after I was born, and I make my father miserable." "He hates the garden because she died," Mary said to herself. "What garden?" Chloe asked. "Oh, just a garden she used to like." Mary stumbled. She quickly changed the subject and told Colin all about her voyage from India. Chloe told Mary how everyone had to do as he said, as being ill made him angry. "How old are you?" Chloe asked. "I'm 10, she answered. "And so are you?" "Because when you were born the garden door was locked and the key was buried. And it has been locked for 10 years. "What garden door was locked? Where was the key buried? Who buried it?" asked Colin. "Mr. Craven," said Mary, nervously. "He locked the door and buried the key, but I found it." Chloe kept asking the questions. "I'll make the servants take me to the garden," he said. "Don't do that," Mary cried. "If you don't tell anyone, I promise you I'll find a way for us to go there together." Once Colin agreed to her plan, Mary relaxed a little. Martha was alarmed when Mary told her that she had found Colin, and been astonished that Colin had been willing to talk to her. Soon afterwards, Colin even sent for Mary. Mary told him all about Deacon, how he was a friend of the animals and how they trusted him. When Colin started to talk about dying, Mary insisted that they talk about other things. The two children soon realized that they were cousins, and they were laughing when Colin's doctor and Mrs. Medlock suddenly walked in. The doctor was worried that Mary made Colin too excited, but Colin said that Mary made him feel better and would continue to see her. The doctor agreed, but warned Colin not to forget that he was very ill. For a whole week after that it rained, and Mary spent hours every day talking to Colin. But on the first morning, when the sky was blue again, she ran straight to the garden. Deacon was already digging and working hard when she arrived. Mary was thrilled to meet his fox captain and a rock-called suit. She was excited too, to tell him about Colin. If he was out here with us, he wouldn't be watching and waiting for lumps to grow on his back, and he'd be healthier, said Deacon. It'd be good for him. But when Mary went to see Colin later on, he was furious with her. "Why didn't you come to see me earlier?" he demanded. "I was walking in the garden with Deacon," answered Mary. "I won't let the boy come here if you spend time with him instead of me," he said. "If you send Deacon away, I'll never come to visit you again," Mary shouted. "You're so selfish." "I'm not as selfish as you," snapped Colin, "because I'm always ill and I'm sure is a lump coming on my back, and I'm going to die." "You're not going to die," shouted Mary. "You just want people to feel sorry for you." "Get out of my room," shouted Colin in a rage. "I'm going," cried Mary, "and I won't come back." That night, Mary was woken by terrible screaming and crying. She put her hands over her ears. "Somebody ought to make him stop," she shouted. But just then, the nurse rushed in and begged her to go to Colin's room. Mary ran along the corridor. "Just stop," she shouted at Colin. "I hate you. Everybody hates you." "I can't stop," he gasped. "Yes, you can," shouted Mary. "All that's wrong with you is a terrible temper." "I felt the lump," cried Colin. "I shall have a hunch on my back and I shall die." "You didn't feel a lump," Mary snapped. There's nothing at all the matter with your back. Let me see. Mary looked at his spine and ran her hand down it. There's not a single lump there except for your backbones, she said. Colin breathed a sigh of relief. No one had ever spoken so crossly to him before, but neither had anyone ever reassured him like that. Do you think I'll grow up? He asked his nurse. You probably will, she answered, if you do not get into such a temper. Do as you are told, and go out into the fresh air as much as you can. I would like to go there with you, Mary, said Colin at last. If Deacon will come and push my chair, I do so want to see Deacon and the fox and the rock. The next day, Mary and Deacon made a plan. Mary ran to Colin's room while Deacon waited. It's so beautiful outside, Mary said. Spring has arrived. There are buds everywhere. She threw open the window to let in the fresh air and told Colin that Deacon was coming to visit him with his animals. Colin couldn't wait to meet Deacon and the animals and told his nurse to bring them straight to his room. A boy and a fox, and a crow and 2 squirrels, and a newborn lamb are coming to see me this morning. I want them brought upstairs, she said. The nurse gave a gasp and covered it up with a cough. Yes, sir, she answered. I'll tell you what you can do, added Colin, waving his hand. You can tell Mater to bring them here. The boy is Mater's brother. His name is Deacon. Deacon came in smiling with the newborn lamb in his arms, the fox cub trotting by his side, a crow on his shoulder, and 2 squirrels. Colin couldn't believe his eyes. Deacon put the lamb on Colin's lap, pulled a bottle from his pocket, and fed the lamb while answering all of Colin's questions. The 3 of them looked at pictures of flowers in a book that Mr. Craven had sent to Mary. I'm going to see all these flowers, cried Colin, and together they planned to visit to the garden. It wasn't long before Deacon pushed Colin's wheelchair to the ivy-covered walls around the secret garden. I used to walk here and think about finding the garden, said Mary, and that is where I found the key. And here's the door. Deacon pushed him quickly. Little green leaves had crept over the walls and trees, and the grass was splashed with the gold and purple of crocuses. As the warm sun shone on Colin's face, he cried out, I shall get well, and I shall live forever and ever. Colin watched as Mary and Deacon worked in the garden. They brought him things to look at, buds, a woodpecker's feather, the empty shell of a newly hatched bird. The afternoon was packed with the new things, and the sun shone golden and warm on them. I never want this afternoon to end, Colin said, but I'll come back tomorrow, and the day after. I will see everything grow here, and I'll grow here myself. But suddenly Colin stopped. Who's that man? He whispered in alarm. Mary and Deacon looked around to see Ben's Weatherstaff glaring over the wall at them from the ladder. He shook his fist at Mary and shouted at her, You young bad-un, you had no business poking around here. But he stopped quickly when he saw Deacon pushing the wheelchair behind her. Do you know who I am? Demanded Colin. Ben Weatherstaff was stunned. I do. You're the poor cripple, he said. I'm not a cripple, Colin cried out fiercely. Don't you have a crooked back? No, shouted Colin. Then, as Deacon held his arm, Colin slowly put his feet onto the grass and moved his weight onto his thin legs. For the first time, he stood upright. Tears ran down Ben's weather-stuffed cheeks. "Hey," he said, "the lies flock tell. You'll be a man yet. Get down from the ladder, and Mary will let you in," Colin said. "I want to talk to you." So Mary opened the door and let Ben inside. "Please keep our secret," said Colin. "I want to visit the garden as much as I can." Ben admitted that for years he had come into the secret garden and pruned the roses because he had been so fond of Colin's mother. But now he was too old to climb over the wall. "How do you like to plant a rose?" "I can get you a rose in the pot," said Ben. "Go and get it," said Colin excitedly. Deacon took his spade and helped Colin to dig the hole. Ben brought the rose from the greenhouse. "Here, lad," he said. "Set it in the earth." "It's planted," said Colin at last, and he looked up at the sky, glowing with happiness. One evening, Deacon told his mother all about Colin and the secret garden. "My word," she said, "it was a good thing that little lass came to a manor. It's been the making of her, and it saved him. What do the flock at the manor make of it all?" "They don't know," answered Deacon. Colin has to keep complaining and pretending that he is still unwell, so that they don't guess. If the doctor knew that Colin was recovering, he'd write and tell Mr. Craven, and Colin wants to show his father himself. Day by day, Colin had begun to eat more. He put on weight, and his cheeks gained a healthy glow. One day, Deacon stood on the grass and slowly went through some simple muscle exercises. Colin watched them with widening eyes. "You must do them gently at first, and be careful not to tire yourself. Rest in between times, and take deep breaths, and don't do too much," said Deacon. "I'll be careful," said Colin. "Can you show me, please, Deacon?" Colin could do exercises while he was sitting down, but after a while, he gently did a few standing on his newly steady feet. Mary began to do them too. The secret garden grew more beautifully each day, with flowers in every tiny space. One morning, Colin was waiting when he stood up and stretched. "Mary, Deacon," he called, "just look at me. I'm well. I shall live forever and ever. I shall find out about people and creatures and everything that grows, just like Deacon. I feel as if I want to shout out something thankful and joyful." Just then, the door in the ivy-covered wall opened, and a woman walked in. "It's Mother," Deacon cried. "I told her where the door to the secret garden was hidden." Colin had heard a lot about Mrs. Sowerby, and was delighted that she had come. "Are you surprised because I am so well?" he asked. She put her hand on his shoulder and wiped the tears away from her eyes. "Yes, I am," she said. "I knew your mother, and you look so much like her that it made my heart jump." "Do you think," said Colin, a little awkwardly, "that it will make my father like me?" "Oh yes, dear lad," she answered, smiling kindly. They led her around the garden and told her everything that had been doing. Mrs. Sowerby had brought them a picnic, and she sat and watched as they ate it. She was fun and made them laugh. Then they told her how difficult it was to keep pretending that Colin was ill. "You won't have to keep it up much longer," she said. Mr. Craven is sure to come home soon. While a secret garden was coming alive, Archibald Craven was traveling around Europe. He was never happy, but one morning a feeling of calm crept over him. He had been miserable for 10 years, but now he thought of home. He wondered about his son, but was afraid of what he would find if he went back. As the summer passed, he felt stronger, just as Colin did playing outside in the fresh air. Then, one day, he dreamed he heard his wife calling him into the garden. When he woke, there was a letter from Mrs. Sorby waiting for him. She reminded him that they had met once before on the moor, and that they had spoken about Mary. She said she thought there was now good reason for him to return home. I will go back to Miss Southworth at once, he said. On his journey, he thought about Colin, and wondered whether the boy was dying. In just a few days, he was home. On the drive across the moor to the house, he decided to find the buried key to the garden. He had been thinking about all the happy times they spent there, and wanted to see again. But when he arrived at the manor, Mrs. Medlock told him that Colin was already in the garden. Shocked, Mr. Craven walked to where the thick ivy hung over the door, and heard laughter coming from inside the walls. He heard running feet, and then the door was flung open, and a boy ran straight into him. He was tall, handsome boy, glowing with life, and when he threw the thick hair back from his forehead, his grey eyes made Mr. Craven gasp. Who? What? He stammered. This was not the meeting Colin had planned, but he drew himself up to his very tallest. Father, he said, I'm Colin. You can't believe it, can you? It was the garden that did it, and Mary and Deacon and the animals. We kept it a secret. Mr. Craven put his hand on the body's shoulders and held him still. He dared not to speak for a moment. Take me into the garden, my boy, he said at last, and tell me all about it. The garden was filled with autumn color. Late roses climbed in the sunshine. Mr. Craven looked around him in wonder. They sat down under a tree, all except Colin, who wanted to stand while he told the story. So now the garden doesn't need to be a secret anymore, Colin said at last. And I'm never going to use the wheelchair again. Ben Weatherstaff had been listening and dashed back to the house to tell the servants what had happened. Mrs. Medlock shrieked with delight when they saw the master of Miss Southworth coming across the lawn, looking happier than they had ever seen him. And by his side, with his head up in the air, walking strongly and steadily, was Master Colin.